"Uncle, be gentle, it hurts. I won't run away. I can't take this anymore." In a dimly lit room, Claire Matthews lay curled up under a thin blanket, trembling with pain. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards under her uncle's heavy footsteps. For 3 months, Claire had been living a nightmare. Everything started the day her uncle's fiancée, Rebecca Evans, disappeared. It was all her fault, at least. That's what Michael Matthews, the man she had called uncle for most of her life, believed. Ever since Rebecca vanished, Michael had locked Claire away in a remote cabin, far from anyone who could hear her cries for help. "I didn't do it," Claire whispered, barely audible. Her voice cracked under the strain of months of futile explanations. No one was listening, not even the man who had once cared for her. Michael didn't respond. His eyes were cold, distant, filled with the kind of hatred Claire had never seen before. The man who had raised her with kindness was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. He blamed her for everything: the photos, the rumors, and most importantly, Rebecca's disappearance. "I know you didn't push her," Michael finally said, but his voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "But none of that matters now. Rebecca's gone because of you." Claire could feel her heart breaking. "Michael, please, just listen to me. Enough," he snapped. His tone cut through her like a knife. "You're leaving. I've already booked your flight. You're going to stay far away, and I'll never see you again." Her stomach twisted with fear. "Don't send me away," she pleaded, reaching out, her fingers trembling as they brushed his arm. But Michael pulled back. "If I keep you here, it'll only hurt Rebecca more when she returns." Claire's eyes filled with tears. She knew he didn't believe her. She had tried to explain countless times how Rebecca had been the one to manipulate things, how she was innocent, but Michael's mind was already made up. To him, she was nothing more than a reminder of everything he had lost. The room fell silent, save for the quiet hum of the wind outside. Michael's dark silhouette disappeared through the doorway, leaving Claire alone, once again consumed by her despair. 3 months earlier, it had been a sunny day in June when everything changed. Claire had been living with Michael since her parents died when she was young. Michael had taken her in, raised her as his own, and for a while, life had been good. But everything fell apart the day the photos were leaked to the media, photos of her and Michael in a compromising position. Claire had no idea how they were taken, but she knew who was responsible: Rebecca. From the moment Rebecca entered Michael's life, she had made it clear that Claire was nothing but an obstacle. And when Rebecca went missing, Michael was quick to point the finger at Claire. "Michael," Claire had tried to explain, "I didn't push her. I didn't do anything to her." But the damage was done. There were missed calls on Michael's phone from Rebecca, a final desperate message: "Michael, help me." Rebecca had disappeared that night, and Claire was left holding the blame. Michael's anger had been swift and unforgiving. "You drugged me. You hired those people to hurt her," he had said, his voice shaking with fury. "I'll never forgive you." The days that followed were a blur of accusations and tears. Michael wouldn't listen, wouldn't hear her out. Claire had tried to tell him that she was innocent, but every word she spoke only seemed to push him further away. Present-day Claire lay still in her bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her body ached from months of confinement, her mind from the emotional torture she had endured. She hadn't seen the outside world in so long. The idea of leaving terrified her, but the thought of staying trapped in this hellish limbo was even worse. She needed to find a way out. That night, she slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the living room, where Michael was sitting in his usual chair, staring into the fire. The flames cast eerie shadows on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the deep frown etched into his brow. "Michael," Claire's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to catch his attention. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone cold and detached. Claire hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to tell him the truth, to make him see that she wasn't the monster he thought she was. But she knew that no matter what she said, it wouldn't change anything. "I don't want to leave," she said softly. "Please, don't make me go." Michael's gaze hardened. "You don't have a choice." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat, fighting back tears. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "I've always loved you." For a moment, Michael's expression faltered. He looked at her with something that almost resembled pity. But then, just as quickly, the cold mask returned. "That's not love, Claire. You don't know what love is." Claire's heart shattered. She knew that, in his eyes, she was nothing more than a mistake, a burden. She had lost him long before Rebecca had disappeared. And now, there was nothing left to hold on to. The next day, Claire's suitcase sat by the door, packed and ready for her departure. She stood in the hallway, staring at the luggage as if it were the embodiment of everything she had lost. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle, but before she could pick it up, Michael appeared in the doorway. "You're really going through with this," she said, her voice hollow. Michael didn't respond. He simply gestured toward the door. "Your flight leaves in 3 hours." Claire bit her lip, the weight of reality sinking in. She would be gone soon, out of his life forever. But even as she stood there, on the verge of being cast aside, she couldn't stop herself from reaching out one last time. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't do it. I didn't hurt Rebecca. You have to believe me." Michael's eyes darkened. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said quietly. "What's done is done." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing alone, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had lost everything that mattered. Later that night, Claire couldn't sleep. The hours ticked by slowly, and the weight of her impending departure pressed heavily on her chest. She had to find a way to stay to prove her innocence. But how? Michael was convinced of her guilt, and there was no one left to turn to. She rose from bed and walked toward the window, staring out at the darkened sky. The stars twinkled faintly in the distance, mocking her with their unattainable brightness. As she stood there, lost in thought, the door creaked open behind her. She turned to see Michael standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael didn't answer right away. He stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, Claire thought she saw something in his gaze, something softer, something almost regretful. But before she could make sense of it, he spoke. "Go back to bed, Claire," he said, his voice low and distant. "You have a long day tomorrow." Claire hesitated for a moment before nodding. She turned back toward the window, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. She could feel the distance between them, the unspoken words that hung in the air like a heavy fog. But there was nothing left to say. As Michael left the room, Claire climbed back into bed, her heart heavy with the realization that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she could never change the past. The day of Claire's departure arrived. The air in the cabin was thick with tension as Claire sat at the edge of her bed, staring blankly at her packed suitcase. The flight was in a few hours, and her mind raced with the same question that had plagued her for months. How could she convince Michael to believe her? The truth was elusive, hidden beneath layers of accusations and misunderstandings. Rebecca had always been a master manipulator, turning Michael against her with ease. Claire had tried so many times to explain, but the web Rebecca had spun was too tight, and Michael's anger too consuming. As she pulled on her jacket, the door creaked open behind her. Michael entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. He had barely spoken to her since the night he'd told her to leave, and the silence between them was unbearable. "Are you ready?" he asked coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. Claire swallowed hard, her throat dry. She nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to scream, to fight back, to tell him one more time that she wasn't the villain in this story. But the words died on her lips. What good would it do? Michael had already made up his mind. She stood and grabbed her suitcase, her hands trembling. "I'm ready," she whispered. As they drove to the airport, the silence in the car was suffocating. Claire stared out of the window, watching the familiar landscape pass by in a blur. Her heart ached with every passing mile, knowing she was leaving behind everything she had ever known, everything she had ever loved. Michael didn't say a word. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. Claire wondered if he was struggling too, if there was a part of him that regretted this. But she couldn't bring herself to ask. The wall between them was too thick, too tall to climb. When they finally arrived at the airport, Michael parked the car and turned to her. "This is it," he said flatly. Claire's chest tightened. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man who had once cared for her. But there was nothing. He was closed off, impenetrable. I'll miss you," she said softly, hoping against hope that her words would reach him. Michael's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he reached into the back seat and handed her the plane ticket. "Go." Claire's hands shook as she took the ticket. She opened the door and stepped out of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to leave. "Not like this." "Michael," she said, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the busy airport. "Please." But he had already turned away, his face set in stone. Claire watched as he pulled out of the parking lot, disappearing into the sea of cars. And just like that, he was gone. Claire stood in the airport, her suitcase by her side, feeling more lost than ever. She stared down at the plane ticket in her hands, her mind racing. She couldn't leave. Not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. Rebecca. Everything had started with her. Claire had always suspected that Rebecca's disappearance wasn't what it seemed. The woman had been manipulative, calculating. She had a way of turning people against each other, and Claire had been her favorite target. But was it possible that Rebecca was still alive? That she had staged the entire thing to make Claire look guilty? The more Claire thought about it, the more it made sense. Rebecca had always hated how close Claire and Michael were, and she had the perfect motive for wanting Claire out of the picture. Claire clenched the ticket in her fist, her heart racing. She couldn't leave until she knew the truth. She had to find Rebecca. But where would she even begin? Claire had been locked away for months, completely cut off from the outside world. She had no idea where Rebecca could be or how to even start looking. Still, she had to try. That night, Claire found herself back at the cabin. The small, isolated house that had once been her prison now felt like the only place she could find answers. The key Michael had given her still worked, and she let herself inside, the cold air hitting her as she stepped into the darkened living room. Everything was just as she had left it, the familiar scent of cedar wood, the crackling fireplace, the faint hum of the wind outside. It was almost as if time had stood still, waiting for her to return. Claire moved quietly through the house, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but something told her that the answers she sought were hidden here, in the very place she had been held captive. As she entered Michael's study, her heart pounded in her chest. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of books, the neatly organized papers on the desk, the familiar scent of Michael's cologne lingering in the air. She approached the desk, her fingers trembling as she opened one of the drawers. Inside, she found a stack of papers, letters, notes, old receipts. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as she dug deeper, her hand brushed against something unfamiliar. It was a small black notebook, worn and frayed at the edges. Claire pulled it out, her heart racing. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a collection of notes, random thoughts, lists of tasks, appointments. But as she turned the pages, something caught her eye. There, written in Michael's familiar handwriting, was a name, Rebecca Evans. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She read on, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what she had found. Michael had been investigating Rebecca's disappearance. Claire sat down in the chair, her mind spinning. Why had Michael kept this from her? Why hadn't he told her that he was looking for Rebecca? It didn't make sense. He had blamed her for everything, yet here he was, quietly conducting his own investigation. The notebook was filled with notes, conversations Michael had overheard, strange occurrences he had witnessed, people Rebecca had met with in secret. The more Claire read, the more she realized that Rebecca hadn't been the victim she had made herself out to be. In fact, Rebecca had been hiding things from Michael. She had been meeting with people in secret, disappearing for hours at a time, and lying about her whereabouts. Claire's suspicion deepened. Rebecca's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was all part of a plan. Suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. Rebecca had staged her own disappearance, framing Claire in the process. She had orchestrated everything, knowing that Michael's love for her would blind him to the truth. Claire's hands shook as she closed the notebook. She had to show this to Michael. He needed to know that Rebecca had deceived them both. But as she stood up, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't alone. Looking for something? A voice said, low and dangerous. Claire spun around, her eyes widening in shock as she saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was Rebecca. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the dim hallway light, casting long shadows across the room. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the woman who was supposed to be missing, presumed dead. You? Claire breathed, taking a step back. How are you here? Rebecca smiled coldly, her eyes glittering with malice. Surprised to see me? The tension in the room was suffocating. Claire's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. She had been sure Rebecca was gone, that Michael's grief and anger were real. Yet here Rebecca was, alive and standing in front of her, perfectly composed as if she hadn't orchestrated months of chaos. I don't understand. Claire began, her voice barely above a whisper. You disappeared, Michael said. Rebecca cut her off, stepping further into the room, her presence menacing. Michael said a lot of things, didn't he? He believed I was the victim. He thought you were the one who hurt me. She chuckled softly. It was all so easy. Claire's pulse quickened. The truth was staring her in the face, but it was too twisted to fully grasp. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. Why would you do this? Rebecca's smile widened, a cruel edge to her features. Because you were always in the way, Claire. Ever since I came into Michael's life, you've been a thorn in my side. He cared about you more than he should have, and I couldn't have that. So, I decided to make sure he'd never want to see you again. Claire's blood ran cold. She had always known that Rebecca disliked her, but she had never imagined the extent of her malice. You framed me, Claire whispered. You made Michael think I was responsible for everything. Rebecca stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Of course. I did. And it worked, didn't it? Michael practically threw you out of his life. He hates you now, Claire. And that was exactly what I wanted. Claire's heart shattered. She had suspected Rebecca of manipulation, but hearing it confirmed in such a cold, calculated way made her feel sick to her stomach. But why disappear? Claire asked, trying to piece together Rebecca's twisted plan. Why go to such lengths? You had Michael. You had everything. Rebecca's smile faltered for a brief moment, her eyes narrowing. Because I wanted more. Michael was too comfortable with you around. I needed him to see me as his savior, the woman he would do anything for. So, I orchestrated my disappearance and made sure it all pointed back to you. The guilt, the anger, it all pushed him closer to me. Claire's legs felt weak. She had been used as a pawn in Rebecca's cruel game, her life torn apart for the sake of this woman's selfish desires. You're a monster, Claire said, her voice shaking with anger. Michael loves you, and you manipulated him, manipulated both of us. Rebecca's expression darkened, her voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. You don't get it, do you? Michael may have loved me, but his obsession with you was always in the way. I had to make sure you were gone for good. Claire's mind raced. She needed to get out of there, needed to tell Michael the truth. But as she turned to leave, Rebecca moved quickly, blocking the doorway. You're not going anywhere, Rebecca hissed. Not until I make sure you never come back. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Panic surged through her as she realized the gravity of the situation. She was alone with a woman who had proven she would go to any lengths to get what she wanted. She had to think fast. What do you want from me? Claire asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Rebecca crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. I want you gone, Claire. For good. Michael might have sent you away, but I can't take any chances. If you're still in the picture, there's always a chance you'll worm your way back into his life. Claire's stomach churned. You're paranoid. Michael has already made up his mind. He's not going to listen to me. Rebecca's eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. Maybe, but I know Michael better than you think. He's still investigating my disappearance, isn't he? I saw the notebook you were reading. Her gaze flickered to the desk. He's not as convinced of your guilt as he pretends to be. Claire's heart skipped a beat. So Michael had his doubts. Maybe there was still hope. Maybe she could still get through to him. But she had to survive this first. Rebecca stepped closer, her expression hardening. You're going to disappear, Claire. You're going to leave this town. And you're never coming back. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it. Claire's breath quickened. She had to stay calm, had to find a way out of this. You can't make me leave, she said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Rebecca smirked. You're underestimating me. I've already made Michael turn against you. Do you really think I can do worse? Claire clenched her fists, her fear slowly giving way to anger. She wasn't going to let Rebecca win. Not again. You're insane, she said, her voice stronger now. Michael deserves to know the truth. Rebecca's eyes blazed with fury. The truth? The truth won't set you free, Claire. It'll bury you. Before Claire could react, Rebecca lunged at her, grabbing her arm and shoving her against the wall. Claire gasped, her body slamming into the hard surface, pain radiating through her back. Don't make me hurt you, Claire, Rebecca growled, her grip tightening. Claire struggled, her heart racing. She couldn't let Rebecca win. She wouldn't let her destroy everything. Summoning all her strength, Claire pushed back, twisting out of Rebecca's grasp and darting toward the door. But Rebecca was faster. She grabbed Claire by the hair, yanking her back. Claire cried out, her scalp burning with pain. Rebecca shoved her to the ground, towering over her with a look of cold triumph. This is what happens when you try to play hero, Rebecca sneered. Claire's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to give up. She reached out blindly, her hand grasping the edge of the coffee table. With one swift motion, she grabbed the heavy glass ashtray that sat on top of it and swung it upward. The ashtray connected with Rebecca's head with a sickening thud. Rebecca's eyes widened in shock as she staggered backward, her hand flying to the wound. Blood trickled between her fingers. You'll regret that. Rebecca spat, her voice slurred with pain and rage. Claire scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't wait for Rebecca to recover. She bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting out of the cabin. The cold night air hit her like a shock. Claire ran as fast as she could, her lungs burning with each breath. She had to find Michael. She had to tell him the truth. But as she raced through the dark woods, the sound of footsteps behind her sent a jolt of terror through her body. Rebecca was chasing her. Claire pushed herself harder, her legs aching with the effort. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let Rebecca catch her. The trees blurred around her as she sprinted toward the main road, her heart pounding in her ears. Up ahead, she saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Relief flooded through her. If she could just reach the road, she could flag down a car, get help, and finally put an end to this nightmare. But as she neared the edge of the woods, she heard Rebecca's voice behind her, cold and venomous. You can't outrun me, Claire. Claire's legs felt like they were about to give out, but she kept going, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel, waving her arms frantically at the oncoming car. The car screeched to a stop, and Claire rushed to the driver's side, gasping for breath. Help me, she panted. Please. You have to help me. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, looked at her in confusion. What's going on? Claire glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. Rebecca was nowhere in sight. Had she given up? Or was she just waiting in the shadows, ready to strike again? There's someone after me, Claire said, her voice trembling. I need to get to Michael Matthews. Please, take me to him. The driver hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the woods behind her. Then he nodded, unlocking the passenger door. Get in. Claire didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled into the car, her heart racing as the men sped away from the cabin. She had escaped for now, but she knew Rebecca wouldn't give up so easily. She had to get to Michael before it was too late. The car sped down the dark, winding road, headlights cutting through the night as Claire sat in the passenger's seat, her heart still pounding from her narrow escape. She glanced nervously out the window, half expecting to see Rebecca's figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the quiet, eerie stillness of the night. The driver, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a worried expression, glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "You all right, miss?" Claire nodded, though her voice betrayed her fear. I will be. Thank you for stopping. I didn't know what else to do." The man frowned, his brow furrowed in concern. "Do you need to call the police? You said someone was after you." Claire shook her head. "No, not yet. I need to get to Michael Matthews. He's the only one who can help me." The driver seemed to hesitate but nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "All right, I know where he lives. We'll be there soon." Claire leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. Rebecca was alive. The woman who had caused her so much pain, who had orchestrated her downfall, was still out there, and she wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. Claire knew that Rebecca wouldn't rest until she was gone for good. But there was something else gnawing at Claire's mind. Michael had been investigating Rebecca's disappearance in secret, and now that Claire knew the truth, she had to confront him. He had to understand that everything Rebecca had told him was a lie. But would he believe her after all that had happened? 30 minutes later, the car pulled up to Michael's house. The grand estate loomed in the darkness, its silhouette barely visible against the night sky. Claire's stomach churned as she stared at the familiar house, memories of happier times flooding her mind. The driver glanced at her. "You sure you're going to be all right here?" Claire forced a weak smile. "I'll be fine, thank you." With shaky hands, she opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The driver watched her for a moment before nodding and driving away, leaving Claire standing alone at the edge of the driveway. For a moment, she hesitated, her feet frozen in place. This was at the moment she had dreaded for so long. She had to face Michael, had to tell him everything. But what if he didn't believe her? What if he still thought she was responsible for Rebecca's disappearance? Taking a deep breath, Claire steeled herself and walked up to the front door. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorbell, but before she could press it, the door swung open. Michael stood in the doorway, his eyes widening in shock as he saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the past few months hanging heavily between them. "Claire," he said finally, his voice rough. "What are you doing here?" Claire swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Michael, I need to talk to you. It's about Rebecca." Michael's expression hardened at the mention of Rebecca's name. "I thought I told you to leave. You're not supposed to be here." "I know," Claire said quickly, her voice trembling. "But there's something you don't know. Michael, she's alive. Rebecca is alive." Michael stared at her, disbelief etched across his face. "What are you talking about? That's impossible." Claire shook her head, her hands trembling. "No, it's not. She was at the cabin. She's been manipulating you this whole time. She wanted you to think I was the one who hurt her, but it was all a lie. She set me up." Michael's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" Claire took a deep breath, her chest tightening. "Yes, I do. I saw her, Michael. She's alive." She admitted everything. For a long moment, Michael said nothing, his gaze locked on hers. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for him to respond, fear gnawing at her insides. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Where is she?" Michael and Claire drove in tense silence toward the cabin. Claire had managed to convince him, though she could tell by the look on his face that he was still grappling with disbelief and anger. Michael's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tightly. "She was there," Claire said softly, breaking the silence. "I swear it, Michael. Rebecca is alive." Michael didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Claire could see the storm brewing behind his cold exterior. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Rebecca had twisted his emotions, and now Claire had to help him see the truth. When they reached the cabin, Michael cut the engine and stepped out of the car without a word. Claire followed closely behind, her heart pounding with anticipation. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet as they approached the cabin. Michael pushed open the front door, his eyes scanning the darkened interior. The cabin was exactly as Claire had left it except for one thing. Rebecca was gone. "Where is she?" Michael asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Claire's stomach dropped as she looked around the empty room. "She was here, Michael. I swear she was here. Michael turned to her, his eyes dark with fury. You said she was alive. You dragged me all the way out here for what? A lie? No, Claire cried, panic rising in her chest. She was here. I saw her. She attacked me, but Michael wasn't listening. His face was twisted with anger, his voice rising as he stepped toward her. I gave you a chance, Claire. I gave you every opportunity to prove your innocence. And you've done nothing but lie to me. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she backed away from him, her heart breaking. Michael, please. You have to believe me. But Michael's anger had reached a boiling point. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm done. I don't want to see you again, Claire. Ever. Claire's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. He was done. He didn't believe her. And now, she had nothing left. She was about to turn and leave when a voice echoed from the shadows. Well, isn't this touching? Both Claire and Michael froze, their heads snapping toward the voice. Rebecca stepped out of the darkness, her face twisted into a wicked grin. Hello, Michael, Rebecca purred, her eyes gleaming with malice. Miss me? Michael's face went pale, shock rippling across his features as he stared at the woman he had believed was dead. Rebecca. Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by fear. Rebecca's sudden reappearance meant only one thing: things were about to get much worse. Rebecca sauntered forward, her eyes never leaving Michael's. You didn't think I'd let you forget me that easily, did you? Michael's jaw clenched, his shock slowly giving way to anger. What is this? What's going on? Rebecca smirked, her expression cold and calculating. Oh, Michael, you've always been so gullible. I never disappeared. I just wanted you to think I did so I could get rid of her. She shot a venomous glance at Claire, who stood frozen in place. Michael's eyes darted between the two women, his mind reeling. You've been lying to me this whole time. Rebecca laughed, the sound chilling in the quiet room. Of course I have. Do you really think I'd let someone like Claire get in the way of what we had? I needed her out of the picture, and you played right into my hands. Claire's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. Michael looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, the weight of Rebecca's deception crashing down on him all at once. You framed her, Michael whispered, disbelief still laced in his voice. Rebecca's smile widened. I had to. You wouldn't have seen the truth otherwise. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling. Michael, you have to believe me now. Everything I told you was the truth. Michael's eyes softened as they met hers, the anger slowly fading from his expression. Claire. But before he could say anything more, Rebecca lunged at Claire, her hands outstretched in a furious attempt to silence her once and for all. Claire barely had time to react. She stumbled backward, her heart racing as Rebecca's fingers grazed her arm. But before Rebecca could grab hold of her, Michael intervened, grabbing Rebecca and pulling her away. Enough, Michael shouted, his voice shaking with anger. This ends now. Rebecca struggled against him, her eyes wild with fury. You're a fool, Michael. She'll never love you the way I did. Michael's grip tightened as he held her at arm's length, his voice low and full of regret. I don't care, Rebecca. You've destroyed everything. The room was filled with tension as Michael held Rebecca at arm's length, his grip firm but trembling. The woman he had once loved had manipulated him, twisted his emotions, and nearly ruined the lives of both him and Claire. Now, the truth was laid bare, but the weight of it was almost too much to bear. Rebecca continued to struggle, her voice shrill with fury. You think you can just walk away from me, Michael? After everything we've been through, Michael's face was pale, his eyes clouded with regret. There was never anything real between us, Rebecca. Everything was built on lies. Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger, and she broke free from his grasp, stumbling back. Lies? She spat. I did everything for you. I made sure her finger jabbed toward Claire would never come between us. And this is how you repay me. Michael shook his head, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. You destroyed everything, Rebecca. You made me turn against someone who only ever cared about me. You poisoned everything we had. Rebecca's face twisted in rage. Everything I did was for us. But you're weak, Michael. You don't deserve me. Michael stepped back, the weight of her words no longer stinging the way they once did. His gaze shifted to Claire, standing just a few feet away, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I'm so sorry for everything, Claire." Claire felt her heart constrict, the emotions of the last few months swirling within her. For so long, she had wished for this moment for Michael to finally see the truth. But now that it was here, the pain and betrayal felt even heavier. She wanted to forgive him, but the wounds Rebecca had inflicted ran deep. Before Claire could respond, Rebecca let out a bitter laugh, drawing their attention back to her. "You think this is over?" she sneered. "You think you can just walk away from everything I've done?" Her hand moved toward the pocket of her jacket, and Claire's heart skipped a beat as she saw the glint of metal and knife. Michael reacted instantly. "Rebecca, don't do this," he shouted, stepping forward, but Rebecca's mind was made up. With a wild scream, Rebecca lunged at Claire, the knife raised high. Claire's body froze, fear paralyzing her as she saw the blade coming toward her. But before the knife could reach her, Michael threw himself between them. The blade caught his arm as he blocked Rebecca's attack, and he let out a sharp gasp of pain, staggering backward. "Michael!" Claire screamed, rushing toward him as blood began to seep through his shirt. Rebecca, momentarily stunned by what she had done, stared at Michael with wide eyes. I didn't mean." But Michael was no longer paying attention to her. His focus was on Claire, his face contorted in pain as he tried to keep pressure on the wound. Claire's hands shook as she reached for him, panic rising in her chest. "Michael, you're bleeding." "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth, though the pain was evident in his voice. "We need to stop her." Rebecca, realizing that her plan had unraveled, turned and bolted toward the door, desperation taking hold. She couldn't face the consequences of her actions, not after everything she had done to keep control. Without hesitation, Claire ran after her, her heart pounding in her chest. Rebecca had caused too much damage. She couldn't let her get away. Rebecca burst out of the cabin and into the night, the cold air stinging her skin as she ran. Claire was close behind, her legs burning with the effort as she pushed herself to catch up. "Rebecca, stop!" Claire shouted, but Rebecca didn't listen. She sprinted toward the woods, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she wove between the trees. Claire's determination drove her forward, her mind flashing back to all the pain Rebecca had caused. She thought of the months she had spent imprisoned by Michael's anger, the nights she had cried herself to sleep, and the constant fear that she would never be believed. This was her chance to end it, to finally put an end to Rebecca's reign of terror. As they neared the edge of the woods, Claire saw her opportunity. With a burst of adrenaline, she lunged forward and grabbed Rebecca's arm, yanking her to a stop. Rebecca screamed, trying to pull free, but Claire held on tightly. "It's over, Rebecca," she shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. "You can't keep running." Rebecca's eyes were wild with fear and anger. "You don't know what you're doing," she spat. "Michael will never forgive you for this." Claire shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You're wrong. He sees the truth now. He knows everything." Rebecca let out a bitter laugh, but it was clear that she was losing her fight. Her strength was fading, and the realization that she had lost was beginning to sink in. "It doesn't matter," Rebecca said, her voice hollow. "None of it matters anymore." Claire tightened her grip, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're going to pay for what you've done, Rebecca. You won't hurt anyone ever again." Rebecca's shoulders slumped in defeat, the last of her fight leaving her. She stared at Claire, her face contorted with bitterness. "I did everything for him," she whispered, more to herself than to Claire. "And now I have nothing." The police arrived shortly after. Claire had managed to pull Rebecca back to the cabin, where Michael was waiting, pale but conscious despite his wound. The sight of the flashing lights and the sound of sirens filled Claire with a sense of relief she hadn't felt in months. The officers quickly took Rebecca into custody, placing her in handcuffs as they led her away. She didn't resist, her once defiant demeanor now broken. As Rebecca was taken away, Claire sat down on the front steps of the cabin, her body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. Michael sat beside her, his arm bandaged by one of the paramedics, though his face was still tight with pain. "Claire," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I don't even know where to begin. I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. I should have believed you." Claire looked at him, her heart aching. She had wanted this moment for so long, wanted him to see the truth, to apologize. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to say. "It's over now," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what matters." Michael shook his head, guilt weighing heavily on his expression. "No, Claire. You deserved better than this. You deserved to be believed from the start." Claire felt tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "We both made mistakes, Michael, but Rebecca's gone now. We can move forward." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. Finally, Michael turned to her, his eyes filled with sincerity. "Can you ever forgive me?" Claire looked at him, her heart conflicted. Part of her wanted to hold on to the anger, the hurt, but another part of her knew that letting go was the only way to truly move forward. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I want to try." Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's all I can ask." Weeks later, the world felt different. Rebecca had been charged with multiple crimes, including assault and conspiracy. The media had covered the story extensively, and the truth of her manipulation and deceit had finally come to light. As for Claire, she had taken time to heal. The emotional scars Rebecca had left would take time to fade, but there was a sense of closure that brought her peace. Michael had been by her side throughout the ordeal, supporting her as she rebuilt her life. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Claire stood on the porch of her new apartment, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Michael joined her on the porch, standing quietly beside her. They had a long way to go, but the tension that had once filled the air between them was gone. There was understanding now, acknowledgement of their mistakes, and a shared commitment to move forward. "Do you think things will ever be normal again?" Claire asked, her voice soft. Michael smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the sunset. "I don't know, but I think we have a chance to make something better than normal." Claire looked at him, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "Yeah," she said, nodding. "I think so too." As they stood there together, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow. And for the first time, Claire felt like she could finally breathe again.